Hi, my name's Peter Ritchie and this is Kayak Fishing Unboxed. Today we're going to talk about the effect the wind has on the water and how it creates waves. We're going to give you an idea of what conditions may be suitable to go fishing in, particularly if you're a brand new kayak fisherman and you just don't know where to start, you've never spent time on the water before, or you just don't have any experience in large bodies of water like the bay. If you've been fishing for a while, then ideally you'll know this anyway. It's probably going to be quite boring, so tune out. But if you want to learn a little bit more, then fantastic. Let's keep talking. This is a map of Port Phillip Bay. Port Phillip Bay is a fairly large expanse of water in Victoria in Australia. It's about 40 to 50 kilometres across from one end to the other at the widest points. It does get severely affected by wind because it is such a large body of water and it's basically flat all the way around it. So what we're talking about is when you see on the weather forecast that they say on the news it's going to be 10 to 15 kilometres per hour from the north. Well, what does that mean and where does that mean you can fish? So we'll start off with a northerly. A northerly will be blowing from the north and it'll be blowing off the shore onto the water. So that makes it an offshore wind as the name suggests. When the wind is offshore, so it's blowing from the land onto the water, then anywhere where the wind is blowing over the land will be relatively calm because the wind hasn't had time to create waves. So while you're fishing close to the shoreline along here, the wind hasn't had time to create any waves, so it's going to be relatively calm. At the other end of the bay, in the same northerly, the wind is now an onshore. So even so the direction is still the same, a northerly, now it's blowing onto the shore. Now, where this becomes significant is that now that the wind's had the whole length of the bay to build up waves. So even though in close around the top of the bay and a northerly might be protected and calm close to the shore, down the bottom end of the bay, it starts to get rougher. Now on a 10 to 15 kilometre per hour northerly, it's still going to be quite fishable down here in most circumstances. 10 to 15 kilometres per hour is probably about the least you're going to generally get as a forecast. They quite often won't say no wind, even though occasionally you get that. They will generally say, 0 to 10, 10 to 15 kilometres per hour. So that's a great place to start. If you're up the north and it's blowing 20 kilometres per hour, then it's still going to be quite protected along this part of the bay. Perhaps not right here if it's a strong wind because you've got the wind blowing onto it. But down here, if it's 20 kilometres per hour, then you'll find that the waves are significantly bigger and it might not be fishable. Now, 20 kilometres per hour is not particularly strong. It's about 11 knots. So what you'll find when it's 11 knots is there's waves forming, there's white caps or white horses, as they're sometimes referred to. It's still quite fishable if you've got the skill and the right kayak and you've had some practice. But if you're heading out for the first time or the second or third time, you're not really sure, then look for the forecast when it says 10 to 15 kilometres per hour. If it's any stronger than that, you really want to be fishing in a location where the wind is offshore. So what we'll look at then is, well, what about other wind directions? And so I think you should be able to get the general idea though, but let's have a chat. So if it's a westerly or northwesterly, which is quite a common wind here. So as a westerly blowing that way, most of the bay is going to be pretty knackered. It's going to be wind onshore, the wind will be blowing onshore. These will be where the big waves are. It won't really be fishable. This area in here will be okay. Some of here will be okay. If it's a bit more northerly than westerly, then along here still looking pretty good as well. You might be able to sneak in around here, but this whole bay area will be okay. Now, another terminology used when we're talking about the wind is a thing called fetch. So fetch is the distance over the water that the wind travels. So if you're fishing in a kayak here and the wind's blowing from the north, the fetch is the distance from where the wind hits the water to where you are. That's only a short distance, so that could be quite comfortable. If the wind's blowing from one end of the bay to the other and you're here, then that's the longest fetch, and so that's where there's most likelihood of the waves being biggest down here. So if you're fishing in a northwesterly over here and it's not too strong, then it still may be quite fishable along here because the fetch, the distance here, is not as bad as the distance here. So, but this is one of those things you'll learn as with experience. That the more times you go and look at the water, you'll find where I was expecting it to be a bit worse than that, or it's better than I expected. So you just basically have to keep notes or keep track of where you go and when and what the forecast conditions are. One thing I'll point out though is if you're not sure, don't go out. Sometimes you just got to be prepared to go and have a look, suck it and see. And if the conditions aren't suitable or you're just not feeling comfortable, don't go. It's always another day. Easterlies are the other wind that we get, and southeasterlies, particularly during summer. So on a southeasterly, we've got a good range to the bay, basically all the way around here, certainly in here and here. And around here may be okay as well, because you've got some protection from the easterly with this headland. Now the waves can swing around. If they're big, they'll go around like that, so it still might not be pleasant. And if it's really strong, well then you'll still get some waves there. But an easterly is good for the east side of the bay. And then the opposite side is going to be the southerly or the southwesterly, which the southwesterly is the predominant wind we get, particularly during wintry months. Southwesterly comes straight up the bay like that. You can see the picture now. Most of the bay, if it's a strong southwesterly, really knackered. This area is pretty good down here. If it's a strong southwesterly, you get some protection close to the shore. Same in here, you get some protection. And around here, depending on the strength of the southwesterly, you still get some protection even up here. If it's that 20 kilometres per hour, that's probably quite fishable. If it's 20 to 30, then yeah, this will all be generally unfishable. So the other thing we need to look at too when we talk about offshore winds. Offshore winds are great because they give you some protection close to the shore. But if you're fishing and it's an offshore wind and it's quite a strong offshore wind, then you risk the fact that if you do happen to fall over the side and the wind's blowing strongly, that actually might blow the kayak away from you. Or if you're fishing in a kayak and you lose your paddle and you can't get back in, and then you're going to blow out to sea. So not a great place to be. So if you are going to fish in a strong offshore wind, then I suggest a secondary power source. So if you're in a pedal kayak, have a paddle. If you're in a paddle kayak, make sure your paddle is leashed to your kayak so that if you drop your paddle, you won't lose it. And secondly, if it's quite a strong wind, I'd really suggest you even look at tethering yourself to your kayak. So if you do fall off, you're not going to lose your kayak. It's not going to be blown away from you. You're going to have more chance of surviving in the bay if you're hanging onto something that's floating than if you're just floating by yourself. And more chance of being found too. So offshore winds are great. But again, go out and experience them. Start off small and go out and test your skill level as the wind increases. The other thing I like to do, if the conditions aren't what I expected, is I actually go home and check the weather sites and the forecast sites to see what the actual wind was while I was out. So they might have forecast 10 knot or 10 kilometres per hour. You get out on the water and you find it's a lot rougher than you expected. You go home and you check, it was actually 20 kilometres per hour. So that's a good way of guessing what might be suitable in the future. So if they say, well, hang on, I was out in 20 and that was quite good, the next time they forecast 20, I know what to expect. And the same, the reverse applies. If you go out thinking it's going to be 20 kilometres per hour and you get out there and it's really calm, go home and make sure it was blowing at 20 kilometres per hour. If it was only blowing at 10 kilometres per hour, you might give yourself a false sense of security that you're better than what you are, or you're more capable of going out in stronger conditions than what you actually are or what you've been at in before. That's all about practice. So start off slow. Really learn your kayak first before you load it with fishing gear. Small, short kayaks got some limitations. So, but even with any kayak, jump on it, go for a pedal in it, tip it over, fall off, practice getting back in. Do it when you're not under pressure. Do it when it's not an emergency. Do it when you don't have it loaded with fishing gear, so you've got nothing to lose and you don't mind getting wet, and spend some time on it so that if it does happen in an emergency, you're not panicking. You know you can get back on. You know how your kayak's going to perform. The next thing we need to keep in mind, particularly in the bay, is the sea breeze. So during summer, what happens is the land all around the bay heats up, and the land heats up faster than the water does. So as the land heats up, it's hotter and hotter during summer. The hot air land causes the air to rise. As the hot air rises, it actually draws in the cold air from the bay. Cold air gets sucked in to replace the warm rising air. That causes an onshore sea breeze. And during the middle of summer, this can come in at 15 to 20 knots. Now, just a quick definition. So kilometre per hour is what airspeeds, winds measured in, let's say, by the average person. When we're talking about marine, we talk in knots. So one knot, 1 nautical mile is 1.8 kilometres. So 10 miles an hour is 18 kilometres per hour. So what we want to look at is, so if the sea breeze comes in, so generally will come in and then move around the land like that, you find that it will come in at 20 to 30 kilometres per hour. It can be really, it can happen very quickly, and it's a very strong wind. And then as the evening progresses and the sun goes down a bit, the land cools, and what that does then is it stops the sea breeze sucking the cold air onto the land, so the sea breeze weakens and eventually drops away as well. So the sea breeze can be quite nasty. It can come in quickly and it can come in quite strong. So if there are forecasts for a sea breeze, keep that in mind if you're out in the kayak late in the afternoon, that you don't get blown off the water. The other thing we need to talk about, and it's not too bad in Port Phillip Bay, is wind and tide. Port Phillip Bay is a very unusual body of water, great big body of water, but it runs in and out through the entrance here, which is really narrow. So with the tide, you've got all this water, has to go out this narrow entrance. Up this end of the bay, up around Melbourne and this area, the tidal flow is very slow because you've only got this bit of water moving that way. Down the bottom end of the bay, you've got all the water trying to get out this narrow gap. So when this becomes important is you might be out fishing here, it's a beautiful breeze. Now, so the tide flow is greatest in this area here, this V, just a natural occurring V, that is where the tide flow is strongest. So if you're fishing down here in your kayak and you've got 10 knots blowing this way and you've got the tide running at 5 knots out to sea, the water's going to be dead flat. It's going to be beautiful and smooth. But then the tide turns and all of a sudden you've got 5 knots going this way, you've still got your 10 knots going that way. What happens then is now you've got 15 knots of wind over water. That creates a very short, sharp, steep wave that at 15 knots will have white caps on it. And it happens quite quickly because the tide turns, it just starts rushing back in again because now it's got to run through here really quickly to fill up the whole bay. So if you're fishing at the bottom end of the bay, be aware of when the tide's going to change, what the wind is doing, and where you're situated. You don't want to be stuck out in the middle here with the wind against the tide. Western Port, completely different, but we'll talk about that on another time. So today's more about Port Phillip Bay. The other condition we need to worry about is called residual waves. And what that happens is that you might be planning on fishing first thing in the morning. You launch here, there's absolutely no wind. It happened this morning, but all night it's been blowing northerlies. So I launched here, no wind, but there were still waves. They're only small waves, up maximum half a metre. So what happens is the wind keeps blowing all night, then it stops, but it takes a while for all these waves coming across the bay to dissipate before they get here. After a couple of hours, it will drop out and it'll be nice and calm. But the risk in this scenario is if there is already a wave base there, is that if the wind does blow, then all of a sudden it's going to build up bigger waves faster because there's already existing waves there. And that can be something to be aware of. So if the forecast is for the wind to build and there's already waves present, be cautious about how quickly it may build up. Now, the exciting bit, storm cells and thunderstorms. We'll go back to the northerly again because this sort of happens during summer the most. You're sitting up here at Point Cook, having a beautiful day's fishing, light northerlies blowing, it's not too bad. They have forecast a possible afternoon thunderstorm. You see the big white storm clouds building over Melbourne. It starts tracking this way. It's getting bigger and wider and fluffier. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, it's not going to go over the top of you. You're watching it track past you. You can see it on the radar. You think, I'm pretty safe because I'm sitting in here. The wind's blowing that way and everything's sweet. Unfortunately, what happens with a storm cell is once it decides to start raining, and then it becomes quite treacherous. So if you're looking at it from the side, you've got the ground level here. Storm cell goes up like this, big anvil head. Now the anvil head's caused because the wind's blowing that way and it's blowing that cloud that way. In the middle here, freezing cold water, hail perhaps. As it starts raining, this cold air drags down, sucks in the hot air upwards to replace it, and as the wind hits the ground, so the rain goes straight down, but the wind actually hits the ground and goes sideways. So if you're sitting over here minding your own business, you watch this go past and it starts raining, all of a sudden you get this wind coming out of the storm cell all the way around it. Now, this is really dangerous, and these storm cells, microbursts, whatever you want to call them, they cause large planes to crash. Coming in low to the ground near an airport, you hit a microburst, you've got wind shear, wind going up and wind going down in opposite directions, and they run out of wind. You're sitting in a little kayak here thinking you're safe, all of a sudden you've got 20 to 30, 40 knots blowing at you in a massively quick build-up of wind and waves. If you're not prepared for it, if you're not watching it, it will swamp you. Microbursts and kayaks do not mix. They are not pleasant. So if you see this happening, get yourself back to shore. Get yourself close to shore. So if it does go pear-shaped, you've got an exit point where you can just pull up on the beach. You might only have to wait half an hour before it blows over, before it dissipates. Turn around and go back out again. But you're probably better off being off the water during that situation. And particularly if there's thunderstorms around. I know I had an incident a couple of years ago now. I was down at Mornington. There was no particular big storm, but there was a lot of thundery and activity in the area. My rods started buzzing, and I thought, this doesn't sound good. So I actually went to pick them up to lay them down flat, and I got a shock off the fishing rod. So I thought, wow, that actually just made me pedal faster to get it back to shore. So I knew the weather was marginal. I wasn't far offshore, so it wasn't a drama, but it was certainly something to be aware of, that it can affect you. So thunderstorms, storm cells and kayaks, do not miss. Avoid them. If you see them, head back to shore, get somewhere safe, wait for it to pass over, then go back out. Final thing I'd like to mention is size and skill do matter. So short kayaks don't really have a place on Port Phillip Bay. Yes, you get away with them. Yes, you won't die every time. And on a perfect day, they are fantastic fun. Unfortunately, they catch you out when it's not a perfect day, or when it starts off perfect but goes pear-shaped very quickly. Short kayaks don't have the stability, and they don't have the capacity to carry a lot of payload. So the moment you put anything on them above the waterline, it might have the capacity to carry 120 kilos, and you weigh 80 and you've got 10 kilos, but that's all above the waterline. That decreases the stability of the kayak. A short kayak is very hard to paddle into the wind, and if you're paddling with the wind and you've got a following sea, you'll find that bigger waves can pick them up and spin them around sideways a lot faster than they will spin a 4 or 5 metre kayak around. So keep that in mind. And if you are going to use a short kayak on Port Phillip Bay, so where they're best is, rivers and small lakes or narrow lakes, make sure you've practiced your entry, your re-entry, or your entry back onto the kayak if you fall over. Make sure you know how fast you can paddle, how far you can paddle. Be prepared to get wet. Make sure everything's leashed down. But we'll talk more about safety in future episodes. But for now, just keep in mind, a short kayak has limitations. You will see people doing things on them who are probably well practiced and have had big kayaks before. And my first kayak was a 3 metre BCF cheapie. Seemed like a good idea, but in the end, I sold that pretty quickly, got a 4.5 metre paddle yak and moved on from there again. So had one. I do know what I'm talking about. They're not particularly safe. Sure, they're a bit of fun on the right day, but it's going to limit your experience. And a lot of people make the mistake of buying a kayak. They don't want to spend a lot of money on a kayak because they don't know if they're going to like the sport. So then they buy a cheap kayak and they don't like the sport because it's short, it's unstable, and it's not very good. If they'd spend a bit more money on a second-hand kayak, then potentially they would have had more fun and upgrade in the future. But anyway, more about that on the next episode. So for today, it's just about wind and weather. If you've got any questions, please send me an email or contact me through YouTube or the Facebook page. And just a quick summary, up to 20 knots is going to be yackable in most conditions, offshore particularly, but offshore, keep in mind about you may be blown out to sea if you lose your paddle or if you have an injury or something goes wrong. So everything's good while it's going well. It's when something goes wrong that the shit hits the fan. So keep that in mind. Small yaks, offshore winds aren't a great mix anyway. Up to 20 kilometres an hour is probably fishable. If you're starting out, 10 to 15 is even better. And I actually would suggest go and fish in an onshore wind, so that if it does go pear-shaped, you're only going to get blown back to the shore where you started from. And if you are heading out on a windy day, I always try and pedal upwind to start with, so that when I'm coming back later in the day, I might be tired, I'm actually coming back with the breeze, and it makes it a lot easier. And finally, the Bureau of Meteorology admit they can be up to 40% wrong with their forecast, and that's still an acceptable error margin. So if they forecast 20 kilometres per hour, then effectively that could actually be 28 kilometres per hour. And if you have a look over here, this would just reinforce what we were talking about before, is that on the news they forecast up to 20 kilometres per hour, 13 to 19 kilometres per hour. That equates to 7 to 10 knots. And that's a slight sea, slight waves, no white caps, no white horses. If you've got the 28 kilometres per hour, well, now you're down here. And this is where it's blowing 11 to 16 knots. And now you've got white caps, white horses, and the seas are up to 1 metre. So keep that in mind. Even though the forecast might be 20, it might actually be blowing at 28 when you're out there. So our last 2 bits of advice: plan for the worst, hope for the best. So go out and expect 15 knots, but hope you get 10. That way you set your goals and your conditions. So it's, all right, well, it might be 15 knots today, therefore I'm going to paddle into the wind, fish, and then we're going to come home with the wind. Those things like that, just try and give yourself the greatest margin of error. And the last thing I want to mention is it is better to be on the land wishing you were fishing than on the water wishing you were on the land. And if you can't figure that one out, then don't go on the water till you can, because there's nothing worse than being in a kayak out at sea in shit conditions, hoping you get back to shore safely. Not an experience you want to go through. I'm Peter Ritchie. I hope you've enjoyed this. A bit of a thanks to the people who are supporting me, and we'll chat very soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.